So Steve S. Asks, why do the proponents of the lack belief definition of atheism seem so resistant to reason? And do you believe it is just because they are afraid of defending the burden of proof on the fact that they don't believe in gods, or is there anything else?
No, I think the principal reason is they come by it honestly. The principal reason is they've just heard it repeated endlessly all over the place. On YouTube channels, conferences organized by these people on the Atheist Experience call-in show, on blogs. I mean, they just see it and hear it repeated so many times that it takes on the character of a truism. And they think, okay, yeah, that's the definition of atheism. Yeah, that's how it works. Yeah, that's what the burden of proof is. Yeah, and they just take it on board, right? Because that's how we learn what words and expressions mean. We just hear them used. They hear them used, and they think that this is right. This is definitive. So I think most people come by it honestly, but it has the effect of making people incapable of defending atheism. You're never going to get good at defending your atheism if you are always throwing up a shield and saying, I don't have to defend my atheism. I don't have to defend my atheism. You have to defend your theism. If that's how you always argue for your atheism, is to say atheism isn't a thing. It's not really a position, right? But you want to claim that thinking that there isn't a God or being skeptical about God beliefs is rational. I mean, look, it doesn't make sense to be skeptical of everything as a default. I mean, this idea of a default position is a terrible idea, right? It's true. I'm born not believing anything, but it doesn't mean that not believing something is a rationally default position. There's no such thing as a rational default position. No position can be rational by default. That's a stupidity, right? You either have a reason and it's a good one, or you don't, right? And if you don't, then it's not a rational belief. And if you do have a good reason, then it's rational to the degree that you have good reasons for it. So no belief is rational by default. So yes, the default position is to not believe something. It's not the same thing as doubting it.
Yes.
You need grounds for doubting something.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? I doubt that there's a teapot in orbit between Mars and Jupiter. Okay? I doubt that. I think that's probably false. My confidence that proposition is false is very high. It would be stupid of me to say, I merely lack a belief in Russell's teapot in orbit between Mars and Jupiter. I don't merely lack a belief in it. Yes, I lack a belief in it. I lack that belief because I think that's false. And I have reasons for thinking that's false. How would a teapot have gotten up there? And if there were like some piece of meteoritic rock that happened to look like a teapot, it wouldn't be a teapot. It would just be a piece of meteoritic rock that in the shape of a teapot. So I have perfectly good, defensible, rational reasons for thinking or for entertaining doubts about Russell's teapot. I don't merely lack a belief in Russell's teapot, and the fact that I was born not believing in it doesn't make the fact that I don't believe it rational, right? So in any case, not believing Russell's teapot is not a proper description of my epistemic attitude towards the proposition. I in fact think it's false. Or maybe you don't think it's false, as I do. Maybe you think it's just dubious. Well, you need grounds for thinking it's dubious. Otherwise, you're doubting irrationally. You think you can't doubt things irrationally? Talk to a conspiracy theorist. They doubt all kinds of things irrationally. There's such a thing as rational belief and rational and warranted confidence, and there's a rational form of doubt, and you can be irrational in your confidence, and you can be irrational in your lack of confidence, in your dubiousness. Right? So doubts have to be warranted. That's another thing that I think is not properly understood because of this concept of a default position, and that my position isn't a position, and only the other side has an epistemological responsibility to establish the rationality of their position, right? So I think people come by this view, honestly, they just heard it repeated, but it leaves them crippled. It leaves them untrained. It leaves them as basically weaklings. And they get beat up in arguments an awful lot. And they come away saying, I really did good. That guy didn't marshal any good arguments. Yeah, but you didn't argue for your position. and he might have argued, given great reasons why atheism is false, and you're not going to bother arguing for atheism, right? So I mean, I see it all the time. I see atheists get into arguments with theists where they get clobbered, right? And they don't know that they got clobbered. They come away thinking, oh no, it's impossible. I can't have been clobbered. It's impossible. I didn't have a burden of proof. I didn't have to marshal a positive argument at all, right? So I think people come by it honestly, but I think it is to their detriment when they take on this belief. And I think it is a way of thinking about argumentation in atheism that is works to our disadvantage and discredits us as having the rational position.
Yeah, fair. I've got a couple of questions from Martijn. The first one, he says, what's your opinion on the one who is said to replace Hitchens? That's Ayaam Hirsi Ali. I've not heard of this person. I don't know if you have.
Oh, yeah, Ayaam Hirsi Ali. She's remarkable. I adore her. She's a Somali-born woman who grew up as an Islamic fundamentalist, and fled her native country, moved to, is it Denmark?
Holland.
Someone hopefully
Holland, I think.
Holland, yeah, okay, Holland,
Netherlands.
and soon mastered the language, got an education, went to university, became the equivalent of a member of parliament there, and wrote a famous book called, is it Infidel?
Infidel, yeah.
Yeah. I've read it, but it was a long time ago. And she became one of the most hunted women in the world, the equivalent of Salman Rushdie. There were attempts made on her life. And she ultimately fled Holland and moved to the United States, which sort of agreed to help provide security for her. Anyway, I admire her tremendously. She's a very outspoken critic of Islam. And that's another tenet of the New Atheism, actually, is that we recognize differences between religions. We don't assume that all religions are just equally good or equally bad. That we take specific claims of the religions at face value. So some religions can be worse than others, right? So, for instance, a Muslim who is an Islamist is a lot more dangerous than, say, even the most fanatical Catholic, because even the most fanatical Catholic isn't going around flying planes into buildings and stuff like that, right? They can get up to plenty of mischief themselves, including murder. But you just have to look up Islamic terrorism and how many acts of Islamic terrorism there have been just since 9/11, and you'll be amazed at the huge number. No other religion can equal this. So there are certain strains of Islam that are particularly pernicious and much worse than any other existing religion. She is one of the Ayaam Hirsi Ali is an apostate Muslim, an atheist now, who is unabashed in her criticism of Islamism, and it makes her very hunted as a result. So I admire her greatly. I didn't know, I'd never heard her described as sort of the successor to Christopher Hitchens, though. I don't know in what respect she's sort of filling those boots, but she's certainly an outspoken critic of religion, specifically Islam, because she's very familiar with it and its nature. So,
yeah, I mean, perhaps it's just the fact that she is as outspoken as Hitchens was. Perhaps I'm not sure. I only got the question, so I'll have to go back to him and ask for more context and maybe address it later. He also asks, "What's your opinion on the accusations launched at Sam Harris being a fascist, racist, or just simply not caring about the lives of Muslims abroad?"
Well, I don't agree with any of that. I mean, he's not a fascist. He's not a racist. And in fact, if you listen to his podcast, he's had a number of really fascinating discussions about racism and the problem of race relations, especially in an American context. I think it's a question that he actually takes seriously, but he just doesn't like pat, politically correct answers. So I think he takes sort of an evidence-based approach to it, and it has him running afoul of sort of so-called woke people. and politically correct views on the subject of race. And nowadays, of course, if you run afoul of any of these views, you get called alt-rights, a Nazi, fascist, all of that stuff. So I think that all of those allegations about him being a fascist are just ridiculous. I mean, he is as well. I don't know that he's as far left as me, but he's pretty far left. There was another part of that question. There was was there something about anti-Muslim? Was that in there? What was it?
Not caring about the lives of
yeah.
Muslims abroad.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't speak to his motivations with respect to caring about Muslims, but certainly he's one of the few people in the New Atheist movement who's made it abundantly clear that nobody suffers more from the stupidities of believing in fundamentalist Islam than Sam Harris. I mean, than other Muslims. According to Sam Harris, it is other Muslims that suffer the most. It is other Muslims that are going to be the most oppressed by this highly intolerant religion. And he thinks that moderate forms of Islam provide luxurious cover to the more strident and extreme forms. Just like moderate milquetoast Christians provide luxurious cover for the most strident, militant, kill crazy, abortion bombing Christians. Right, abortion clinic bombing Christians, I should say. So I think that no, I don't think he has Muslims in slight regard. I take him at face value when he says that a world without Islam would be a world where the Muslims of the world are better off.
Yeah, fair. Good answer. Kriss asks, what do you think atheists could do to improve the perception of atheists and atheism while still speaking out against irrational religious practices and beliefs?
Don't be a dick. Be polite. So be intellectually honest. Don't strawman your opponent, and be intellectually charitable. Credit your opponents with intelligence. Hear out your opponents. Familiarize yourself with their views, and then critique them. Don't critique them, find out you got it wrong, and then try to come up with another critique on the fly. That doesn't work so well. So try to familiarize yourself with your opponent's views. So basically, don't be a dick. Just practice conversational intolerance, which isn't fighting. It's conversational. You're supposed to have a conversation. It's conversational intolerance. The idea is you're not just going to let people make their religious claims and let them go unchallenged. You're going to go, oh, wait a minute, you believe that really? Like, I mean, how would you defend that, right? Because I think this, right? And then, present the argument, right? So just, engage in discourse, civil discourse. Civility is absolutely important. And we atheists, I think, labor under the stereotype of being angry and militant and rude. Okay? That is the stereotype that we have been saddled with. Okay? Don't live up to that stereotype. Okay? Violate that stereotype, right? Break free of it and demonstrate it to be false, right? I mean, so many people in the world say, I've never met an atheist, or I've never talked to an atheist. Well, they've never talked to an atheist because they're not meeting new atheists who practice conversational intolerance and are willing to discuss these subjects in a civil manner. And those that have very often had encounters with atheists have very, very bad experiences with it. Find them to be, rude or dismissive or insulting or ridiculing. And consequently, they don't get their minds changed. They just come away with a bad opinion of atheists. So that is probably the biggest thing. Practice conversational intolerance. Don't be a dick. Don't argue with memes. Okay? Memes don't change people's minds, right? They get a giggle out of the people on your team, but that's it, right? They don't play well to your opposition. I mean, honestly, if you're as an atheist, how often have you been tempted to become a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or a Hindu, right? Because you saw a meme, it just doesn't work. Don't argue by memes.
Yes. Actually, I think I might know the answer to this next question. It's from Andy, and he goes, what is the worst or some of the worst arguments you hear from atheists online? think that's
Oh
going to tie
man,
in. Yeah.
that's I mean that's a long list, and we've already touched on
Yeah.
a bunch of them that I think qualify as the worst. Certainly, not understanding the burden of proof is a terrible one. Um, uh, Insisting that atheism isn't a position at all, and that you don't hold it after you demonstrated in other ways that you do. That's certainly one of the worst things you can do. But if you're looking about specific arguments, there are sort of naive forms of the argument from evil that I think are pretty bad. Um, um, there's a lot of circular arguments that beg the question. So, for instance, here's a valid argument for atheism, a positive argument for atheism. Okay, all gods are supernatural beings. Naturalism is true. Philosophical naturalism is true. If philosophical naturalism is true, there are no supernatural beings. Therefore, no God exists. Okay, there you go. That's a valid argument. The question is naturalism true? I hear people argue that way all the time. They will say gods can't exist. Gods are impossible, right? They will insist um, on a naturalistic metaphysic in a question-begging way. It's okay to say, I think gods can't exist because I'm a philosophical naturalist. But then you have to give reasons why you're a philosophical naturalist. And there are reasons for that. What are they? Go to YouTube and look up philosophical naturalism. Go to Wikipedia, go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, even better, and look up philosophical naturalism. And there you will find the argument. You will find the case for philosophical naturalism. And now you're not arguing in a question-begging way, in a way that assumes that your opponent's worldview is false and that your view is true. So that's another huge one, is assuming philosophical naturalism or materialism. A lot of naive scientism. There's a lot of arguments from naive scientism, but I mean, we're going to get into the weeds if we get into the specifics, and there's a lot of them. So I hope that what we've covered so far addresses the questioner's concerns.
Yeah, definitely. Alan G has a couple of questions. He says, do you think it's actually possible for someone to truly hold a psychologically agnostic stance without some form of neurological issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you've ever been undecided on something, should I stay or should I go? Should I go to the party or not? Should I ask her out or not? Well, look, you're agnostic all the time. There's lots of times where you're inconclusive, where you cannot make up your mind. Should I vote Conservative or Democrat? Should I vote Labor or Tory? There are people who agonize over things like that all the time. Well, why can't one of the things that you agonize and are indecisive about be whether or not a God exists? When people say that, when they imagine that this is impossible, I think there's two things operative. One is a failure of imagination on their part. You are unable to imagine a decent reason to believe in a God. So you think they either have to, believe some manifest twaddle, or they ought to be an atheist, right? It doesn't occur to them that maybe an argument that you think is a terrible argument for God. They look at that argument, they go, I think that's such a pretty good argument. Maybe they don't see the flaws in it, right? So if they don't see the flaws in that, in an argument for God's existence, but they don't think it's conclusive, they realize, well, it seems I need a little bit more than that, right? They might have two or three arguments for God's existence, okay? The cosmological argument, where did the universe come from, right? The teleological argument, there's so much order, harmony in the universe, right? That can't just be a coincidence. That couldn't have happened, right? These are all reasons that people actually have for thinking that the universe is an artifact, that it's a creation, okay? Now, I know arguments against those arguments, so I can rebut those, right? I think I have defeaters for those arguments, right? And you might think you have defeaters for those arguments, but that person you're talking to might not have a defeater. So by their lights, they have a decent reason for thinking God is a possibility, but they might think that, well, it's not a slam dunk though, right? And they might know of some arguments some independent arguments against the existence of a God, but they're indecisive about how good those arguments are. So what are they supposed to do? Pretend to be a theist? Pretend to be an atheist to satisfy your view that you got to belong to one or the other? Or should they just do what they ought to do? What any rational person should do when they can't reach a rational conclusion? Don't reach a conclusion. When you don't have good grounds for reaching a conclusion, you shouldn't reach a conclusion. You should say, I don't know, can't make up my mind. right?
Yep.
It has nothing to do with knowing. It just I don't know in the sense of I can't decide. I don't know which party I should vote for, right? It might be obvious to you that you ought to vote Democrat, and it might not be obvious to them. Right? It might be obvious to you that they ought to vote Republican. It might not be obvious to them. So um, that's one thing that I think is going on there is a simple failure of imagination um, uh, uh, on how the other person views the arguments and the evidence for and against a God that leaves them in a position of indecision. The other thing that I think might be operative here is this: people observe rightly, look, either a God exists or a God doesn't exist. Right? It can't be both, and it can't be neither. Right? This is like even and odd. Right? A number is either even or odd. Any positive integer is either even or odd. It can't be anything else. So God exists or doesn't exist. Which is it? But the fact that there are only two ontological states, there are only two ways of this, that reality can be here, doesn't mean that you have to commit to one or the other. For the reasons I just said earlier, if I can't make up my mind. So if I say, I'm thinking of a number, or I've written down a number. Here's the number, but it's written on a piece of paper, but I'm not showing it to you. Is it even or odd? And you go, well, I don't know. Well, make up your mind. It's either even or odd. Well, I can't make up my mind. I can't make up my mind until I see it. Then I'll know, right? And some questions are not as easy as even and odd, right? And so the fact that there are only two states of being, two ontological possibilities, does not mean that there's only two epistemic stances that you can adopt. You can adopt the epistemic or doxastic stance of believing that it is the case. You can adopt the opposite stance of believing it is not the case, or you can find yourself in the position of indecision or inconclusiveness. And that's not an irrational position to hold. That's the position that you ought to hold when you find yourself in those epistemic circumstances.
Yeah, good answer. I think where he was coming from was the fact that your brain does tend to lean one way or another when you are, especially if you have enough information about a topic. If you've spent a lot of time looking into, say, rather than just someone going, "Oh, by the way, God exists." If you've actually spent lots of time looking into arguments for and arguments against,
sure.
His point is that they'll probably be leaning one way or another, and maybe, but I think what you're saying, you're almost applying a layer of epistemic agnosticism to say, well, I'm not really convinced either way, even if I do slightly lean that far, I'm still on the fence.
Yeah, I would say, I guess the expression "on the fence" is misleading because it makes it sound, because to be on the fence, you imagine there's a huge area on one side of the fence, a huge area on the other side of the fence, and the fence is this little point that you got to, be precariously and perilously balanced on. And I don't think that the fence is like that. I mean, it's more like a big fat wall that you can stand on. So let me give you an example. Supposing I have a deck of cards, okay, and I deal out a card face up, and let's say it's a red card, okay. And I show you beforehand that it's a fair deck. I'm not a magician. It's not a magic trick. We're just doing an experiment, okay? And I deal out a fair card, and it's a red card, okay? And I deal out another one, and it's red, okay? And I say, okay, what do you think that the next card is black, right? And you'll go, well, I don't know. I mean,
exactly.
Well, would you agree that don't you think it's slightly higher? And you'll go, yeah, it's slightly higher. Well, shouldn't you be committed to it being black? Well, no, because it hasn't crossed the threshold of to convince me yet. I don't find, okay, so we keep going, right? That red card comes out, red card comes out, red card comes out, right? I just randomly shuffled. It just so happens that a lot of red cards are coming out. Maybe a black one comes out now and again, but mostly red cards. So now look, come on, you got to admit, the next card, much more likely to be black, right?
Yeah.
And you'll go, yeah, it is more. Well, so is it black? Well, yeah, probably. Will you bet money on it? Well, no. I mean, there'll be some point at which you would bet money on it.
Yeah.
But where is that point, right? And that's how it is with belief revision and belief choice. It is not the case that just because you are 51% in this direction that you're committed to that conclusion. That's not how commitment works, right? I don't believe something because it's 51% more likely. I believe that it's 51% more likely. That's my belief, that it's 51% more likely than not. It's not my belief that that's the outcome. It's just, so people have this idea that agnosticism has to be you look at the information and it's exactly equal in both directions, right? On both sides for you. No, that's not agnosticism. I mean, ask yourself, if I said, do you want to have, you want to order Chinese food or do you want to order a pizza? And you go, I can't make up my mind. Well, okay, but don't you have a preference? You go,
Yeah.
well, I don't know, maybe Chinese food. It's been a long time since I've had Chinese food. Okay, but is that your preference? And you go, well, not really. I mean, you decide, right? And we do that all the time. Honey, do you want to have sex tonight? We do that all the time, right? People make up their minds on things, but sometimes they can't make up their minds. And the fact that you have an inclination slightly in one direction does not mean you belong in that camp with people who are committed, who have concluded, yes, this is true. Yeah, I think this is right.
Yeah.
So that's how I would view agnosticism. Don't think of it as standing on the fence, as standing on a picket fence where you can only be there temporarily for a short time and then you're going to fall off one way or the other. You better make up your mind. Think of it as a big fat wall that you could drive a car on, right? That's what you're standing on, right? And you got a lot of leeway before you, one direction or the other, before you commit to jumping off on one side or the other.
Good analogy. Really good
Thanks.
analogy. He also asks, where's the line between new atheists, as in those who simply believe gods do not exist and are vocal about their position whilst promoting critical thinking and rationalism, and the new atheists who are basically evangelicalist and in promoting atheism as the more rational position and demean superstitions and supernatural explanations of experiences?
Oh, where's the line?
Yeah. I suppose the only way you can really translate that one is basically you have to judge the behavior of the person. There's a difference between someone just being vocal and someone being a dick.
Yeah. I mean, the new atheism is an attitude. It's what you're going to do. It's a decision or a commitment to how you are going to proceed when the discourse of faith comes up. What are you going to do? How are you going to proceed? Right. The recommendation from most of these authors behind the new atheism was, advanced rational arguments, historical, scientific, moral, philosophical, scientific, all of that. Advanced rational arguments, right? Don't resort to violence, don't bully people, and stuff like that, right? Well, but you might suck at that, right? You might advance all kinds of arguments, but you might be ignorant on the science. You might not know much philosophy. You might misunderstand some things, and so you might be very bad at being a new atheist. Well, that's okay. You can be a bad Christian apologist or a good Christian apologist. You could be a bad counter apologist or a good counter apologist, and it's the same thing with the new atheism. So, I don't sort of see this in terms of heroes and villains. I see it more in terms of people who uh, 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 know how to argue, literally have some good critical thinking skills, and so know how to argue, and also have some good interpersonal skills, and have enough self control to not flare up and fly off the handle in people's faces, right? I'm not too cruel to people who are on my side and are doing a crappy job, and it's up to those of us who think we can do a better job to sort of try to ameliorate their behavior, and coach them. And better yet than even coaching them, which can be resented, is just model the right behavior. Try to be out there yourself, being a better apologist. And if you're the kind of person that kind of gets hot under the collar and flares up and you get into flame wars with people, then stay out of those arguments, right? You're not cut out for it. You are temperamentally not well suited. And that's no different than telling a person, you don't know enough on this subject to be arguing about it, so you should stay out of it, right? If you don't know the arguments that you're up against, and so you can't know what the good objections are to it, then you really should stay out, at least temporarily. And similarly, if you are temperamentally ill-suited to this task, then don't do it, because you're just going to make yourself and everyone else around you miserable, and possibly work in ways that are to the disadvantage of your actual agenda here. So I don't see this in terms of villains. I see these in terms of skills, knowledge, and capacities that people have. Matt Dillahunty, I think, is actually a really good debater. I don't think he wins every debate, but he's good at debating. I would suck at debating, okay? But I'm better at exposition. So I do that, right? and I do pretty well in sort of one-on-one conversations. But one-on-one showdowns online and stuff like that, I've done a few of those. I don't do particularly well in those, right? Because you got to think fast. You got to think about what the audience is doing, and you can't stop and go and think. You've got to share time with the other person. I'm very verbose, as every listener is already aware. It takes me a long time to get my ideas out there. This is not conducive to good debating. So, I mean, just play to your strengths, right? And try to get better at the ones that you're not good at, but maybe don't venture into it. So, as for where there's a line, I don't worry about who the good guys are and the bad guys are, who are the good new atheists and bad the new atheists, right? I just try to model this as best you can, and try to disabuse people where you can politely, because they know you and like you and trust you, and try not to go around correcting everybody's behavior on the internet, because even when it's done by someone who's on your side, it might not be terribly welcome unless you are diplomatic about it.
Awesome. Actually, Alan just chimed in there in the chat and said that's a great answer. So I'm glad you managed to get a chance to watch live, Alan. Cheers, dude.
Thanks for the question.
So I've got, in fact, a couple from Real Atheology. He says, could you share some differences between new atheists and contemporary atheist analytic philosophers like Mackie, Oppie, and J.H. Sobel?
Okay, Real Atheology. Okay, so if I'm not mistaken, this is probably Ben Watkins, my friend. I hope I'm not hacking you. Ben Watkins has a YouTube channel and a podcast called Real Atheology. If you're not familiar with it, check out Real Atheology. I'm assuming this is the same person, but it's an excellent channel. And they were kind enough to have me on as a guest on their podcast once, where we talked an awful lot about the definition of atheism, actually. So, all right. So, could you rename who are the analytic philosophers? These were contemporary analytic atheist philosophers that he named. One was
Mackie, Oppie.
Mackie, okay.
Mackie, Oppie, as in Graham Oppie, and J.H. Sobel.
Sobel I'm not familiar with. I don't think any of those figures would sort of qualify as participating in the new atheism, as far as I know. I mean, they are practicing the tradition of just the role. They're fulfilling the role of an atheist philosopher, and they've existed for centuries. They are atheist philosophers. They put forward counter apologetics. They argue positively for atheism. I don't know about Sobel, but Mackie and Oppie do. They argue, they make a positive case for atheism, and they argue against the traditional apologetics put forward by theologians and religious philosophers. So they're just sort of chugging along, as I see it, doing the same work that the old atheism always did. As I said at the outset, and throughout, the new atheism is as I see it, is a shift in discursive emphasis and how we treat workaday conversations out there in the world, not something you do in the academy and in periodicals and journals, philosophy journals and such. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe Mackie did do this kind of stuff. Maybe Graham Oppie does do this stuff. I mean, certainly Graham Oppie has appeared in live streams like this and has debated theists, or at least had conversations with them. I've witnessed some of them. So maybe that can qualify. But I sort of see the new atheism as sort of the average person doing this, and not necessarily engaging at some elite level of philosophy like these other figures you mentioned. But certainly nothing they're doing is inconsistent with the new atheism. It's just I just don't see it as an outgrowth. I don't see anything that they do as hinging on the existence of the new atheism. In other words, if the new atheism had never come up, if that phenomenon, the cultural phenomenon, had never been realized, I don't know that they'd be doing anything different.
Fair. He does actually clarify in the chat saying J.H. Sobel was the leading defender of atheism before Oppie and authored Logic and Theism. And it's, according to a lot of theist philosophers, it's actually the best defense of atheism ever published. So it might be
Wow.
one
Okay.
that
Well, I'm embarrassed.
we should all
I'm
check that one
embarrassed
out.
that Yeah, no, I'm embarrassed that I haven't read it. Okay, well, as long as the title's there, I will go look that up because that would be interesting reading. Because if this is Ben Watkins, I respect his opinion mightily on this kind of thing. He's an extremely well-read person on these subjects. His counter apologetics are strong.
Yeah,
follow him on Twitter. He's brilliant.
Yeah, I've been following him on
Oh,
Twitter
yeah,
for
I'm
a
not
little
on Twitter.
bit, and I've
Yeah.
I checked out a video of his the other day. I think he was on someone else's stream actually, and he seemed like a really decent guy, and it has encouraged me to look into more of his stuff as well.
Yeah, Ben's a really smart guy. He does his homework, and he's charitable in debates. Um, uh, although he seems a little strident on the political subject. I've noticed that we're friends on Facebook. He's a little strident on political subjects, but he shows absolutely remarkable, commendable restraint on the subject of religion and theology and atheism. So
Yeah.
I recommend his channel, and I recommend him on Twitter, except that I'm not on Twitter. I've never seen anything he's done there, so I'm not on Twitter.
Yeah. Actually, you do have a profile there. It's just never been used, it seems.
Yeah, well, yeah. So let me say a moment because people are always asking me to get on Twitter, and I don't like Twitter. I just don't like the interface. I find it confusing, and I've never gotten used to it. And I don't like the sort of the flavor of discourse there. It just seems that the medium is conducive to a lot of fighting and not a lot of you know edification. But I created an account. Do you remember when there was this Rosetta mission where we were launching, the European Space Agency was launching um, a vessel that they launched it like decades ago to land on a comet. They wanted to land on a comet, so they flew out. It was a 10-year mission to get out to a comet and then land on a comet and have a little orbiter, a little rolling orbiter that would be deployed there and take measurements as it whipped around the sun. So I was really interested in that kind of stuff. I still am interested in these kind of stuff. So I created a Twitter account so that I could follow the minute by minute updates of the Rosetta mission. So that's why I created my Twitter account. And after that, I followed a few people, a few friends and a few sort of major figures like Sam Harris, for instance, in the Great Debate. But that's it, and I have never really used it. I think I tweeted hello or something. That's it. I think I might be guilty of one tweet.
Yeah, that's fair enough. It is a very difficult platform, I found. The character restriction is one of the pains, and also you have people who want you to break down these incredibly complex concepts into 280 characters. And you're like, well, look, I've written an article on this that explains this in more detail. Why don't you have a read on it? And then if you want, we can go to DM or you can write in the comments on the site. And we'll have a proper discussion about anything that you feel I was unclear on or wrong. Like, no, write it in the tweet. And you're like, okay.
Right.
He's also asked another 2 questions as well, actually. He's asked for some book recommendations.
Sure. I hate that. Okay. What does he want? What does he want? I hate giving out book recommendations.
What do you think the best books defending theism and the best theist philosophers / defenders of theism are?
That's kind of hard. Okay, well, I mean, he doesn't need any recommendations from me on the subject of sort of high-end philosophy. In fact, I'm sure he's more up to date, more current on that than I am. So let me scale this down to sort of what most listeners would be interested in. So, if you really want to familiarize yourself with really good arguments for God, go back to some classics. Okay, read Thomas Aquinas. You don't have to read the entire Summa Theologica, which is this massive, multi-volume set. You just look up Aquinas's 5 ways, or Thomas Aquinas's 5 proofs of God. They're excellent. You think you know them. You will have heard versions of them, look up Thomas Aquinas and read Thomas Aquinas and try to come to grips with these arguments. Don't just poo-poo it and say, oh, it's, it can't be right. Don't go in with the assumption that it can't be right. Try to wrestle with these arguments. Try to find out which premise is actually wrong here. Is there actually a problem with this inference? Does this conclusion follow or not? Is it valid? Is it sound? I mean, so I think one of the best places to go is there, because those are very early arguments, but they are still some of the most often cited arguments, right? Like the causal argument, the cosmological argument, the argument from contingency, the teleological argument, right? These arguments are still to this day among the most convincing arguments, right? They are things that give people pause. People who are not believers hear these arguments and go, maybe there is something out there. Now, they might not come out of that a Christian, because none of these arguments actually implies a Christian God, but they are formidable arguments in that they persuade an awful lot of people to take very seriously the question of God's existence. Right? It certainly moves a lot of sort of people who are atheists, having never believed in God, right, into a position of agnosticism, right, or questioning their atheism very seriously. And some people, fall right into theism or deism or something like that. So, I mean, I think on the theistic side, I'd say Thomas Aquinas, and don't go try to read the whole book; it won't be of interest to you. But just look up Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways or 5 proofs of God, and contend with those. Familiarize yourself with those, because so much is an offshoot from that, and they're valuable in their own right. And then on the atheistic side, that's kind of harder to do. I'm going to have to give that a think. I'm going to pass on that, because there are books that I can think of, but they're like, Michael Martin's book and stuff like that. They're kind of textbooky, and they'd be a little too dry and uninteresting and long. So I'm going to take a pass on that. But I mean, you can just look up, books for atheism or books that argue for atheism, and you'll find all kinds of stuff. What am I doing? If anyone's going to recommend a book on this subject, it's Real Theology. So please, I'm gonna pass the buck here. You are the person. You are the man who should try out some titles, sort of at a very high level, if you like, an academic level, for sort of more advanced readers. But if you could maybe throw out a book or a title or two in the comments that are sort of pitched for people that are newer to the great debate and not as well versed in the subject, that would be great.
Yeah,
because you will have read more of them than I. You will have read more of them than I, for sure.
And actually, Dave, do you have any recommendations on either side yourself?
Yeah, but I'd have to look up the book titles, to be honest. Atheism, A Guide for the Perplexed is a nice, easy read.
Cool. And what about philosophers themselves on both the theistic and atheistic side?
On the theistic side, let me think about that. On the atheistic side, I love David Hume. David Hume is fantastic. His dialogue on natural religion is amazing. So I absolutely love him. On the theistic side, best. I'm trying to think if it's someone contemporary. I'll recommend. I'll recommend. Oh, geez, I can't remember the title though. But if you look it up, and you'll find it immediately. William Lane Craig's book is
Reasonable Doubt.
That's the one. That is a book that is kind of an important book, because so many people read it. So many Christians read it. So many of us in the Great Debate are engaged with Christian apologetics, and the arguments in there, they don't convince me. Obviously, I would have come away a theist if they had. But they're good arguments. They're respectable arguments. They're reasoned arguments, and they are mighty convincing to a lot of people. And you're going to encounter them out there. So if you're interested in participating in this debate, and I've been saying all along, familiarize yourself with these arguments. Read William Lane Craig's book, Reasonable Faith. don't get hung up on the preface. That he says something in the preface of the introduction that kind of a lot of atheist brains blow up when they read that part. But you'll know what I mean when you read it. But just plow through the whole book. It's a good book. It's clear. It's well written. And there's some bamboozling that goes on in there, in my view. But it is a full-blooded defense of the Christian faith. And he argues for a creator God to begin with, before he gets into sort of more Christian doctrines. He argues for just a generic creator God. Everyone knows the Kalam cosmological argument. Practically, most people involved in this discussion encounter it fairly early on. Mm-hmm. William Lane Craig is the contemporary philosopher who has sort of resurrected this old argument and made it so popular and prominent, such that we all know it by name. So yeah, William Lane Craig.
Yeah, cool. He's actually come back as well. So he's said the best argument against
bit now. I think that his work in the grievance studies program, sort of exploding a lot of woke nonsense in academia, I think has been invaluable. He's had to pay a fairly significant professional price for having done so. I don't think he's a great philosopher, but I think he's done the world some good there with his collaborators in the grievance studies project. But I didn't like that book, and because I didn't like that book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, I thought, I'm going to hate street epistemology. And when I started seeing street epistemology videos, I did see it as a kind of manipulation. It did seem a little bit manipulative. It did seem like people were just being nice to people on the street in order to try to turn them into atheists. But I think street epistemology, sort of under the leadership, I guess we should call him the leader, the leadership of Anthony Magnabosco. Sorry, Anthony, for mangling your name there. Anthony Magnabosco. He's put out a ton of video and content, and he's gotten a lot of people involved in street epistemology, which is just the practice of going out and asking people questions about some important consequential belief that they have, and then just interrogating, just asking them polite questions with a view to getting them to think, right? To try to raise some doubts. Asking them, how did you get to this belief? How do you justify this belief? Basically, it's as if he's trying to sort of teach basic epistemology. I'm just going to go out there and get people thinking about, how did I get at this belief? How do I justify belief? With a view to sort of getting that to sort of infect their brains, parasitize their brains, so that that they don't just do it for this particular question, but that it spreads into their thinking generally. I think that's a good project, actually. I think it takes a remarkable amount of self-control to do, and these people who do it have gotten a lot better at it. And Anthony, if you watch his videos, if you go to the street epistemology channels, and if you look up Anthony Magnabosco, you'll find his channel in particular. You'll see him doing this, and they don't just ask people about God; they'll ask people about anything, veganism, some political thing, but he just gets people. Usually it's just people walking on the street, on a college campus, on a hiking trail, and they just say, hey, do you have a few minutes to talk? I'm just, working on this project. I'm asking people this. And he records the conversation. You see both sides. You see him and the other person from multiple camera angles. And then he uploads the whole conversation. And it's interesting. You get to see people in the act of thinking and trying to defend things that they deeply believe, but they have perhaps never thought about very deeply, although they believe them deeply. So I like street epistemology. I think it's a good thing. I didn't like it at first. I have to say, I felt very cynical about it, and I think it has moved away from the kind of narrow intention that it originally had when it was supposed to be as as part of a project of a manual for creating atheists.
Mm.
But I think the view that they have is now this. And we're not going to try to convert people into atheists. What we're going to try to do is infect them with a better epistemology, and people will move away from irrationality and superstition and and religiosity, and they'll move in the direction of atheism. In other words, you get atheism as a byproduct of just giving people a better epistemology, and I think that's the way to go. I mean, I've never thought of myself as a proponent of atheism or part of the atheism movement. I've been described that way, but I don't see myself that way. I see myself more as someone who's interested, who enjoys philosophy and wants to sort of propagate certain philosophical notions, improve people's understanding of philosophy, help improve their epistemology in particular. And I think that will nudge people in that same general direction. So to that end, I see street epistemology and what I have done on YouTube over the years as sort of working in concert, doing the same kind of project.
Mm.
So I like street epistemology, although I didn't at first.
No, fair. Good answer. We've got our last couple of questions then. If anyone's got any, get them into the chat. Adam asks, why do you think Matt Dillahunty keeps using lacktheism?
I'm hoping to have a conversation with him about that fairly soon. We had said that we were going to have a conversation about that some weeks ago, and then the day of, he was feeling very unwell, and we had to postpone it. And Matt has a very, very busy schedule.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even now, lockdown with COVID, he's still scheduled and overscheduled to do all kinds of things. So we had agreed to have a conversation, and one of the things we were going to talk about was that. So I'm actually interested in knowing why he's so wedded to it. I mean, I have my own views about why it is. I mean, I think all the political reasons. You want to increase the numbers and stuff like that. I think there is some misunderstanding of burden of proof on his part. But I think he has revised those views, and I think he's upped his game considerably. And now I think I see some tension in him on this question. I think, though, on his call-in show, it makes perfect sense. His call-in show is kind of like street epistemology. That is, with street epistemology, you walk up to a person and we say, tell me a belief that you believe, very, very profoundly, something consequential, and I just want to ask you questions about it. Okay? In such a situation, you are asking the person about their views. You're not talking about your views. Right? And on the atheist experience, that is a call-in show where that's what people are supposed to do. They're supposed to call in, and he asks them about their views. I think it makes perfect sense to say there, look, we're going to bracket what I think of God, and the burden is on you because we're interrogating your views. So I think that makes sense. What I think happens though is all too often, Matt injects his own views, or his guest host or co-host injects their own positive claims on the matter. And then they take on a burden of proof as soon as they do that, a discursive burden of proof as soon as they do that. And then the caller wants to know, well, why do you think that? Or why do you think that's a good objection? Or why do you think this is irrational? And then Matt has to explain why and stuff like that. So I think the format of the show is such that it makes a certain practical sense to say, listen, we're going to bracket our views. We're here to interrogate your views. And I think that's okay. Where I think it's a mistake is when Matt does a debate on God's existence, for instance. And everyone knows that he's an atheist who thinks there actually is no God. For instance, they're debating the existence of the Christian God, let's say. And he thinks it didn't happen, right? Or he thinks the resurrection didn't happen. Let's say they're arguing about the resurrection. Well, everyone knows that Matt isn't agnostic about whether the resurrection happened. Clearly, Matt thinks that the resurrection didn't happen. So he should present arguments against the resurrection. He shouldn't just criticize the other guy's arguments, right? He should make the case for it. And similarly, when they're arguing about God's existence, I think he should be making the case for God's non-existence. So I think for the call-in show, it makes sense, but then you have to be careful how you proceed. Otherwise, you end up taking on a burden that you don't want to take on for the purposes of that discussion. And I think he makes a mistake when he ends up playing hide the ball with his position by adopting the lack theism definition. I think that's a mistake. I don't think it convinces any theists. I think he gives good arguments against his opponents most of the time, and so that I think works on the audience. They go, "Oh, yeah, that was a good rebuttal that never got properly addressed," or something like that. But no one's going to come away thinking, "This Matt Dillahunty guy, I think he's right about there being no God, no Jesus, no resurrection," and that's because he doesn't make the case for that. And I mean, if anybody could make that case well, it would be him. I mean, if there's any sort of person that isn't a historian, that isn't a philosopher or anything like that, just sort of a lay person, lay educated person who could make that case strongly, it would be him. And he's got the talent for debating. I think he could actually do a yeoman's job.
Yeah, fair. Actually, link us as soon as you're going to have that conversation. If it's going to be recorded, I'd be very interested to find that.
I don't know if it's going to be recorded or not. I know he wants to sort of have me on. I've been on his atheist debates podcast a couple of times, and I know he has a new show now. He's said, "No, we should get you on," so that might happen. So it might get recorded, but it might not. I had in mind that it was just going to be a casual conversation between two friends saying, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? I object here, you object there. And I thought we were just going to have a friendly conversation. But it might be something that he'd want to record, and I wouldn't have any objection if he wanted to record it.
All right, well, I hope it is, but understandable if it isn't. Adam also asks, have you seen Steve McRae's WASP argument?
Yes, and I'm struggling to remember what it stands for.
So that is the weak atheist special pleading.
Special pleading, yeah. So yes, and I agree with it. It seems to me valid and sound.
Yeah.
But I cannot recall the argument now, so I can't lay it out. But it seemed to me a perfectly valid and sound argument.
Yeah, I think. I mean, Dave, you actually had a similar one. Before I even knew Steve's argument, Dave presented a similar one. It was essentially, if you can define an atheist by what they lack belief in, then you have to also define or allow a theist to be defined by what they lack belief in, and they lack belief in God not existing. But then you've got the people who say, well, I don't hold a positive belief, I only lack belief, therefore they're lacking belief both ways, and therefore that would make them either a theistic atheist or an atheistic theist, which is a contradiction, or you're guilty of special pleading saying, no, that only applies to atheists, it doesn't apply to theist.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. I mean, I've advanced that same argument years and years ago. I said, look, you can define an atheist as someone who lacks a belief in the existence of God. You can define a theist as someone who lacks a belief in the non-existence of a God, right? I mean, every theist lacks belief in the non-existence of God, right?
Yep.
Because if that weren't true, they wouldn't be a theist. So yes, every theist lacks a belief in the non-existence of God. There you go. I've just defined theism negatively. It's not a positive claim; it's a negative claim. Ta-da! Right now, how impressed are you? Doesn't that just sound like a dumb semantic trick? Yes, it's a dumb semantic trick. Well, it's a dumb semantic trick when an atheist defines atheism negatively as well.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, if the atheist can do that, then by parity of reasoning, just consistency of reasoning, the theist can do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Neither one is intrinsically a positive or negative claim, right? Because any positive claim can be simply restated negatively, and in a negative claim can be restated in a positive form. So this idea about there are positive claims and positive assertions have a burden, but negatives, no, that's not true. All claims have a burden of justification, right? If I say, this isn't a cup in my hand, I've got some explaining to do. Okay. Right. The fact that I said this isn't a cup in my hand, that's not that's a negative claim, but it's a claim. It's claims that have right? It's as soon as anything has a truth value, as soon as anything can be true or false, you incur a burden of justification right then and there. In fact, it doesn't even have to be true or false. I mean, if you say, I'm undecided, you have a burden of justification. You have to explain why it's rational to be on the fence. Agnostics don't get away with anything,
No.
right? They have to justify and explain why it's rational to be undecided, right? Because presumably they think it's rational to be undecided, and they think I'm making a mistake, right? And they think the theist is making a mistake. And there are different kinds of agnostics, and we don't need to get into all that right now. But yeah, so it doesn't matter if you characterize your the fact that you think that there isn't a God in negative terms. It doesn't change anything. And the fact that you have never in your life been willing to say there is no God, just ask yourself, is that what you think is true though? Do you actually think that there's no God? Right? Do you think it's don't you like me just think it's just BS and it's all made up? Yes, is that what you think? Welcome to atheism, right? So now go ahead and try to think of the reasons why you think that. Presumably you have some, articulate and share them with people. And there you go. You're discharging your burden of justification, and you cannot be charged with burden shifting and playing hide the ball and redefining atheism. You don't need to do any of that. This is all game playing. There's no need to do it. I think all of this was sort of well motivated by a desire to get theists to take up their burden when they would shirk it and shove it onto atheists and say, well, you're the ones with the you're the outliers who don't believe there's a God. You need to look. It was necessary to get them to own up to their burden, right? But that's not a reason for us to shirk our burden of justification.
Yeah, that's fair enough. More than fair enough. Right, so that's it for the questions from the audience. Dave, did you have any for Ozzy tonight?
No. I was going to ask about whether the echo chambers of Facebook sort of create a self-assessment and a self-fulfilling idea about what the atheists think about themselves, but that's a long conversation.
Yeah,
and we've kept them for a long time.
Yeah, well, let me just say, I have belonged to a lot of atheist groups on Facebook. I seldom participate in these groups, but I belong to them so that I can observe them. I don't like what I see there. There's an awful lot of patting each other on the back, a lot of self-congratulation that goes on there, and a lot of reinforcement of stupid ideas. And when someone like me comes along and says, "Well, no, hang on, I think this is a mistake," or this is a dumb meme, that makes us look stupid. I don't believe in evolution. I accept evolution is true, or something like that, right? You get dogpiled on, people just jump on you and stuff like that, and you can sort of go down, fighting there endlessly. But the problem with that is that there's 80 of them and one of you, and they all reinforce each other in thinking that you're the idiot, right? So I think that Facebook, maybe Twitter's the same way, but I think that Facebook groups really create intellectual silos that run contrary to the goal of critical thinking and open-mindedness and intellectual charity. They're just little electronic churches where people go in and recite their atheistic catechism, right? So I don't participate in them, or extremely rarely. But I like to be, a member of these groups and look in and go, oh my goodness, I like to sort of, stick my finger in the wind and see which way the wind is blowing. So that's a good way to do it. But yeah, these are like little churches where people just reinforce the same idea over and over and over and over again. And I think that to a certain degree, when you're a newly minted atheist, it can be useful to be in the company of people who will encourage you that it's okay to shed your faith and stuff like that. But you can take on a lot of bad, stupid ideas and a lot of bad epistemology and a lot of bad rhetorical strategies and a really ugly view of theists. I mean, there is a lot of theist bashing that goes on in these groups. And it's not an exaggeration to say that some of these groups are hate groups. Now, I don't believe in banning hate speech or anything like that, so I never would report anybody for things that they say in these things. I think people are allowed to express these things, and I think people need to be allowed to express these things. And we certainly want to know what people believe. But there are some people who just out and out hate the religious, and it just becomes another form of bigotry. And I don't think that secular or atheistic bigotry is any better than religious bigotry.
That's basically how I feel. Hence why I don't really use.
Oh, Dave, you're cutting out. Is your
Yeah, you cut out a little bit there.
Sorry. That's one of the reasons why I don't use them. I have a kind of similar opinion to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard. Even in groups that we either run ourselves or moderate on, you notice it going on, and you try so hard to keep everything open and reasonable and respectful, but it still quite often ends up that way. There's still a bit of dogpiling going on. It's easier when you're running the group yourself to say, stop that or you're out. But you also don't necessarily want to censor people. You want to try and bring people round to reason. As Alan has just said in the chat, it says, when he hears someone like you say that he's made a mistake, he stops and listens intently and would encourage anyone else to do the same. And I think that goes back to our earlier conversation that we had about, when trying to change a mind, respect matters. Now, there's going to be people out there that don't know who you are or your experience with this stuff, so they're going to have instantly do the dogpiling thing we speak of. But this is why other atheists out there, if they're getting involved in these conversations with theists, that they shouldn't just be ridiculing. They're either ridiculing because they think it's funny and they're trying to get the pats on the back, which isn't really good. It's basically bullying. Or, they're trying to change a mind, but they're not going about it the right way. And it can be very, very difficult to get the right formula to do this sort of thing. And I think everybody is a bit different. But what we need to do is try and be respectful, charitable, and try and engage people on that level. Find out exactly what they believe and why they believe it first, and then start your probing questions, and then maybe start critiquing it if you find that there's clear gaping holes. Try and draw their mind to other things.
Amen. That'll get me in trouble with somebody.
So I think we've kept you and our audience long enough tonight. I must admit, I've had a really good time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ozzy.
Yeah, it's
the pleasure was all mine.
Hear
Thank
a
you very much.
Side to New Atheism as well, because there is so much negativity to the position currently online. It is used to describe the dogmatic fundamentalist anti-philosophy type atheists, but actually all it is really supposed to describe is atheists that are just a bit more vocal. The problem is they're a bit vocal in the wrong way, and perhaps that's something that hopefully people can take away from tonight's stream and reassess the way they do it. Ozzy, is there anything you'd like to share before we sign off for the night?
No, not really. I mean, if anyone's looking for my content, I have a YouTube channel. It's not monetized. I don't make any money off it or anything like that. There's no merchandise or anything like that. It's Ozymandias Ramses II. And I have a Facebook page that goes by the same name, where I occasionally post stuff. I'm not particularly active on social media, but if anyone's interested in more of my stuff, you can find it there.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is a lot of fun. The time flew. I just noticed I thought it was 2 hours. It's been 3 hours.
Yeah, that's why I felt bad asking my question, because I realized just how long we had you.
Yeah, but anyway, thank you, and thank you to your audience. If anybody has listened for 3 hours, I really appreciate it. It's quite a compliment.
Yeah, thank you everybody that's been listening and submitting your questions, and to anybody who's catching this on the rerun. Yeah, and obviously big thanks to you for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Anytime. This is fun.
Yeah, I think that's a wrap for the night. So you've been listening to the sci-fi broadcast from the folks that brought you fresh air. I'm Joe.
And I'm not Joe.
And
you're agnostically Joe. Good night, all.
Good night, all. Take care, Ozzy. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Good night.